What if a single note could change everything? A scared little boy slips an off-duty royal guard a crumpled message. "They're taking her. Midnight. The hidden gate." Before he can ask questions, the boy vanishes. Is it a prank, a warning, or something far worse? By midnight, he'll uncover a dangerous secret hidden within Buckingham Palace, one that someone will do anything to keep buried. Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. Before we dive into this gripping story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Buckingham Palace stood tall against the evening sky, its golden gates gleaming under the dimming sunlight. The air carried a crisp autumn chill, and the steady hum of tourists filled the atmosphere. Some snapped pictures, others whispered in awe. The guards on duty remained statuesque, their crimson uniforms and tall black hats giving them an almost mythical presence. But Edward "Eddie" Langley wasn't on duty today. Dressed in a simple navy coat and dark jeans, Eddie sat at a cafe just across from the palace gates, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held the weight of years spent standing motionless in that very courtyard. He took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Was it time to leave the service? The thought had been gnawing at him lately. He had joined the Royal Guard with pride, believing in duty, honor, and tradition. But standing still for hours, watching the world pass him by, had chipped away at that passion. These days, he felt like more of a statue than a man. A gust of wind blew past, rustling the pages of a nearby newspaper. Eddie sighed. Maybe it was time for a change. Just as he reached for his wallet, ready to pay for his tea and head home, a small figure appeared at his table. "Excuse me, sir?" Eddie looked up. A boy, no older than 8, stood before him, shifting nervously on his feet. His dark brown hair was tousled, his cheeks a little smudged with dirt. His oversized jacket suggested it belonged to someone much older. But what struck Eddie most was his eyes. Wide, uncertain, but filled with something deeper. Something urgent. Eddie raised a brow. "Yeah?" The boy hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the crowd as if making sure no one was watching. Then, in one swift motion, he slipped a crumpled piece of paper onto the table. "Please, you have to help," the boy whispered. Eddie stared at the note, then back at the boy. But before he could say a word, Tommy turned and bolted into the crowd, vanishing within seconds. Eddie frowned. His instincts, sharpened by years in service, told him something wasn't right. He picked up the note. The paper was wrinkled, the edges torn. Slowly, he unfolded it. And when he saw what was written inside, his pulse quickened. Eddie's grip on the paper tightened as his eyes darted across the hastily scrawled message. "They're taking her. Midnight. The hidden gate." His heartbeat quickened. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written in fear or perhaps in a hurry. Who was her? And what hidden gate was the boy referring to? Eddie's gaze lifted instinctively, scanning the crowd for the little boy. But Tommy was gone. A sharp exhale left his lips. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe for the kid to still be lingering, waiting for some kind of confirmation that Eddie had read the note. Instead, he had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, swallowed up by the bustling evening crowd near Buckingham Palace. For a moment, Eddie just sat there, his fingers still pressing into the worn edges of the paper. Was this a joke? It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to mess with a royal guard. Tourists, pranksters, even kids sometimes tested the limits of their composure. Maybe Tommy had overheard some tall tale and decided to rope Eddie into his little fantasy. Yet, something about the boy's expression nagged at him. It wasn't mischief. It wasn't the playful smirk of a kid trying to see if he could get a reaction. It was fear. Eddie's training had taught him to read people. Over the years, he had seen all sorts: tourists snapping pictures, locals hurrying past, occasional drunks causing trouble. But Tommy, that kid, was genuinely afraid. And that fear had been directed at him. Eddie ran a hand down his face. "Think, Langley. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he should just go home, forget this ever happened." But the words on the note burned in his mind. "They're taking her." Who was her? A friend? A sister? A stranger? He sighed. He had 2 choices. Throw the note away and dismiss it as nonsense, or find out what the hell was going on. Then, just as he made up his mind, he felt it, a prickle at the back of his neck. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. Eddie's muscles tensed. Years of standing guard had sharpened his awareness. He knew the difference between casual glances and something more deliberate. Slowly, he lowered the note, eyes shifting to the edge of the street. And that's when he saw him. A man in a long coat, standing still across the road, partially obscured by the shadow of a street lamp. He wasn't doing anything, not checking his phone, not looking around like a lost tourist. He was watching Eddie. Their eyes met for half a second, then the man turned and walked away. Eddie's stomach tightened. That wasn't normal. He stood up, chair scraping against the pavement. His instincts were screaming now, telling him this was bigger than some prank. The note, the boy, the man in the coat, something was happening, and Eddie Langley was no longer just a bystander. Eddie didn't waste time. If there was even a sliver of truth to what the note suggested, he had to act fast. His first step? Finding Tommy. The palace grounds were still buzzing with life. Tourists wandered, cameras flashed, and street vendors called out, selling everything from keychains to Union Jack scarves. Eddie moved with purpose, scanning the crowd, looking for that familiar mop of unkempt brown hair. Nothing. He approached the nearest street vendor, a middle-aged man selling roasted chestnuts. "Hey mate, did you see a boy come through here? About 8 years old, brown hair, looked a little out of place?" The vendor squinted, stirring the steaming batch of chestnuts. "Lots of kids running around. What's he to you?" Eddie hesitated. How much could he really say? "Slipped me a note and ran off. I just need to know where he went." The vendor scratched his stubbled chin. "A boy like that? Think I saw him near the gates, but he ran off toward the service entrance round the side. Looked like he was in a hurry." Eddie gave a quick nod and moved on. He followed the vendor's directions, cutting through the crowds and heading toward the side entrance used mostly by staff. He knew the area well. It was where off-duty guards sometimes entered, and where palace workers came and went. As he reached the quiet, dimly lit alley leading to the service entrance, he spotted someone he recognized. Mr. Holloway, one of the palace's longtime janitors. An older man with a wiry frame, Holloway was sweeping the cobblestone path, humming softly to himself. Eddie stepped closer. "Mr. Holloway," the janitor looked up, surprised. Well, well, if it isn't Langley. Thought you were off duty." "I am," Eddie said. "But I need to ask you something, it's important." Holloway leaned on his broom. "Go on, then." "A little boy, about 8 years old, Tommy Wells. Do you know him?" The name made Holloway pause. His grip on the broom tightened slightly before he exhaled, nodding. "Aye, that'd be Margaret Wells' son." Eddie's gut twisted. "Margaret Wells?" Holloway sighed. "Used to work here. Maid for nearly a decade. Honest woman. Then, out of nowhere, she was dismissed." The janitor hesitated. He lowered his voice, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "Officially, they said she was caught stealing." Eddie frowned. "And unofficially?" Holloway's expression darkened. "Word among the staff was that she saw something she shouldn't have." Eddie's pulse quickened. "What kind of something?" "No one knows," Holloway said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after they let her go, she vanished. No job, no word from her. Just gone." Eddie clenched his jaw. Margaret Wells. Fired under strange circumstances. Disappeared. And now her son was running around slipping cryptic warnings into the hands of palace guards. This wasn't a coincidence. "You said she vanished," Eddie pressed. "Where did she live? Where would Tommy go?" Holloway shook his head. "Last I heard, she had a small flat in Pimlico, but no one's seen her in months. As for Tommy, no idea, lad." Eddie needed more. If Margaret Wells had been fired for what she knew, what had she found? That led him to his next call, Sophie Clark. A palace historian and part-time journalist, Sophie had spent years studying the secrets of Buckingham Palace, the ones people rarely spoke about. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. After 3 rings, she answered. "Eddie, this is unexpected. I need your help," he said, cutting straight to the point. "I need to know about something called the Hidden Gate." There's a brief pause on the line. Then Sophie's voice came back, lower, more serious. "Where did you hear that?" "An 8-year-old slipped me a note, said something was happening at midnight near the Hidden Gate." Another silence. Then Sophie said, "Meet me in 20 minutes, same cafe as last time." The line went dead. Eddie pocketed his phone, exhaling sharply. He wasn't imagining things. Something was happening, and it was all leading him straight into the shadows of Buckingham Palace. Eddie arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early. He took a seat in the farthest corner, his back against the wall. Old habits. His mind was already working through the puzzle. The note, the hidden gate, Margaret Wells' sudden dismissal, And now Sophie's reaction. Something about this ran deep. The cafe door swung open and Sophie walked in, a brown leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She spotted Eddie instantly, her usual casual demeanor replaced with something tense. She slid into the seat across from him, leaning in. "I don't know what you've stumbled into, Eddie, but I spent the last 15 minutes digging through some old records." Eddie nodded. "And?" Sophie exhaled sharply, pulling out a small notebook. She flipped to a page, tapping the paper. "Lady Eleanor Armitage." The name didn't ring a bell. "Who?" Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "A relative of the royal family. Born in 1943, she vanished in 1968. Completely disappeared without a trace." Eddie frowned. "And?" Sophie leaned closer. "She was last seen near the west wing of the palace, right where that hidden gate is." The words landed like a weight in Eddie's chest. The same hidden gate mentioned in the note. He took a slow breath, eyes narrowing. "What do people say happened to her?" Sophie glanced around before answering. "The official story, she left the country for personal reasons. But rumors? They say she found out something she wasn't supposed to know, and then she was gone." Eddie didn't like the way this was lining up. A woman disappearing because she knew too much? Sounded awfully familiar. "And there's more," Sophie said, flipping to another page. "The hidden gate. It's been bricked up for decades, but according to the palace's security layout, there's still a passage leading to it from the inside. It's not on public record." Eddie ran a hand down his face. "And tonight, at midnight, someone is using it." Sophie's eyes met his. "That's what the note says." A shiver ran down Eddie's spine. He checked his watch. 9:17 p.m. If something was happening at midnight, that left him just under 3 hours to figure out what. Eddie needed more information, fast. His first instinct was to check the security schedules. He knew how the patrols worked. Every wing had its own rotation, but the west wing, where the hidden gate was, had the lightest security detail at night, because it was considered the least vulnerable entry point. Except someone knew better. Eddie made a quick call to a former colleague in the security office. "Hey, Liam. Need a favor." Liam groaned on the other end. "You're off duty, Eddie." "Not tonight." By the time Eddie left the cafe, his mind was racing with half-formed theories. Tommy's mother. The hidden gate. Lady Eleanor. Someone trying to get in. Or out. Of the palace. The air outside was colder than before. The streets had thinned out, leaving only the occasional couple walking along the pavement, or a black cab humming past. Eddie turned down a quiet street, heading back toward Buckingham Palace. And then, 2 men stepped into his path. They were dressed in dark suits, blending almost seamlessly into the dimly lit road. One was tall and stocky, the other leaner but no less imposing. The stocky one spoke first. "You should drop this." Eddie's muscles tensed. He kept his expression neutral. "Drop what?" The leaner man took a slow step forward. "We know who you are, and we know what you're looking into. Consider this a warning." Eddie stared them down, his pulse steady. "A warning about what?" The stocky man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Stay out of this, or you won't like what happens next." And just like that, they turned and melted into the crowd. Eddie stood there for a moment, jaw clenched. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. Someone didn't just want this secret buried. They were willing to do whatever it took to keep it that way. The encounter with the 2 men had left Eddie shaken but not deterred. If anything, it proved he was on the right track. Now, he needed to find Tommy. Eddie moved through the dimly lit streets, scanning every corner. Tommy was out there somewhere, scared and alone. The alleyways near St. James's Park were quieter now, the city settling into its late-night hush. Eddie's boots crunched against the pavement as he turned a corner. And there he was. "Tommy?" The boy was crouched behind a set of metal bins, his small hands clenched into fists. His clothes looked even dirtier than before, his face streaked with worry. Eddie approached slowly, crouching to Tommy's level. "Hey, kid. You all right?" Tommy flinched at first but then recognized him. His lip trembled. I thought they got you." Eddie's stomach tightened, so the boy knew he was being watched too. He exhaled, keeping his voice steady. "I'm fine, but we don't have much time. I need you to tell me everything. Who's they? What's happening at midnight?" Tommy's gaze darted around the alley before he spoke in a whisper. "It's about my mum." Eddie nodded, encouraging him. Tommy took a shaky breath. "She worked at the palace. She was a good worker. Never stole anything, never did anything wrong. But one night she overheard something she wasn't supposed to. Eddie leaned in. What did she hear? Tommy swallowed hard. Two men, big important ones, talking about a midnight transfer, something they needed to keep quiet. Eddie's jaw clenched. And then, Tommy's voice wavered. She tried to find out more. She told me she was worried. And then, the next day, she was fired. Just like that. Eddie felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. Margaret Wells had been silenced. But why? Eddie kept his voice calm. Tommy, listen to me. Do you know what the midnight transfer is? Tommy hesitated before nodding. I think. His voice was barely audible. They're taking a girl. Eddie's pulse quickened. A girl? Tommy's eyes welled with tears. A princess. Or something like that. She's been staying at the palace, but no one's supposed to know. Eddie's mind raced. A young royal relative. Hidden away. A secret transfer. In the dead of night. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. This was a kidnapping. The weight of Tommy's words sat heavy on Eddie's chest. If the boy was right, there wasn't much time left. He had spent years patrolling Buckingham Palace, knowing every doorway, every hidden corridor. But tonight he wasn't a guard. He was a man acting on instinct, stepping into something far bigger than himself. It was nearly midnight. He had to move. The air was crisp as Eddie made his way toward the West Wing. The palace loomed in the moonlight, its golden glow casting long shadows on the courtyard. Most of the guards had rotated out for the night, leaving only a skeleton crew on patrol. Eddie stayed in the darkness, his movements sharp and practiced. He had no authority here, not anymore. If anyone caught him sneaking into the palace, he wouldn't be given a chance to explain. As he neared the old servant's entrance, he pressed himself against the cold stone wall. His heartbeat drummed in his ears. Then he saw it. A narrow wooden door, tucked away beneath an ivy-covered arch. Someone had used it recently. Eddie's fingers brushed the handle. He took one last glance around, then slipped inside. The scent of aged wood and dust filled the passageway. The walls were damp, the narrow corridor barely wide enough for him to move through without brushing against them. His footsteps were careful, his breathing controlled. The passage sloped downward, leading him deeper beneath the palace. This wasn't a part of the building that tourists, or even most staff, ever saw. Dim lighting flickered from lanterns mounted along the walls. Someone had prepared this place. At the end of the corridor, a heavy wooden door stood slightly open, a sliver of light spilling through. Voices murmured on the other side. Eddie pressed himself against the wall, straining to listen. Everything is ready. We move her in 5 minutes. His jaw tightened. They were about to take her. No time to hesitate. Eddie inched forward, peering into the chamber beyond. The room was larger than he expected. An old basement storage chamber, now repurposed. Stacks of crates lined the walls, and in the center of the room, a girl. She sat on the floor, her hands bound, her expression frozen with fear. Lady Isabella Montrose. She couldn't have been older than 12, her royal lineage evident in the way she carried herself. Even in this terrifying moment, Eddie's stomach turned. The boy was right. The men guarding her stood near the doorway, their backs partially turned, and Eddie recognized them instantly. The same men who had confronted him outside the cafe. One of them checked his watch. 4 minutes left. Eddie's pulse quickened. This was it. He took a slow, steady breath. He had to act. For a split second, Eddie's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. One of the kidnappers. Sergeant Duncan, a man Eddie had trained with, stood guard with, shared quiet, disciplined moments of duty with outside the palace gates. Yet here he was, standing alongside criminals, a gun at his hip, a cold, knowing smirk curling his lips. You should have walked away, Langley. Eddie's fingers curled into fists. This wasn't just some rogue operation. There were people on the inside. There was no time for hesitation. Eddie lunged. The nearest thug, a tall, broad-shouldered man, reacted first, swinging at Eddie's jaw. Eddie dodged, countering with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The man gasped, staggering backward, but before Eddie could press forward, another attacker rushed him from the side. A wild fist clipped Eddie's shoulder, sending him stumbling. Duncan stepped in then, drawing his weapon. "Enough," he barked. "You don't know what you're messing with." Eddie glared at him, chest heaving. "You're a traitor, Duncan." Duncan let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, come on. You've been in the service long enough to know how things really work. The powerful protect their own. You think this girl matters?" Lady Isabella whimpered behind them, her wide eyes locked onto Eddie. Eddie's mind raced. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He needed an opening. Then, a flicker of movement near the entrance. Tommy, the boy was crouched in the shadows, gripping a loose cobblestone in his small hands. His face was tight with fear, but determined. Eddie held Duncan's gaze, keeping his stance relaxed, as if defeated. "You're making a mistake," he said, slowly shifting his weight. "You know I can't let you take her." Duncan sighed, lifting his gun. "Then I guess you won't be leaving this room." A sudden thwack. Duncan let out a startled grunt as the rock slammed into the side of his head. Tommy had thrown it with all his might. For a split second, everyone in the room froze. Eddie didn't. With a burst of speed, he lunged at Duncan, slamming into him before he could recover. The gun clattered to the floor. The other thug swung at Eddie, but Eddie ducked, twisting his arm into a lock before shoving him backward into a stack of crates. Duncan, dazed but furious, scrambled for the weapon. Eddie drove his fist into Duncan's gut, knocking the wind from his lungs. The traitorous guard crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Eddie turned, chest heaving. The fight was over. Tommy stood frozen, his eyes wide. Had he just helped take down a royal guard? Eddie met his gaze, giving the boy the smallest nod of approval. Then, he turned to Lady Isabella, still bound, still trembling. "It's okay," Eddie murmured. "You're safe now." Eddie's breath came in sharp bursts as he hoisted Lady Isabella into his arms. She clung to his jacket, trembling, her small fingers gripping the fabric like a lifeline. "Hold on," he murmured. "No time to waste." Tommy ran beside him as they slipped through the hidden passage, the same way Eddie had entered. Footsteps echoed behind them. Guards, reinforcements. He had no way of knowing whether they were allies or enemies. Then, an alarm blared through the palace grounds. The entire building was awake now. As they neared the western wing, armed royal guards flooded the corridor. The moment they saw Eddie, a superior officer barked, "Stand down! He's got the girl!" A second later, Lady Isabella spoke up. Her voice weak but determined. "Saved me." The guards lowered their weapons. Behind them, the kidnappers were dragged out. Sergeant Duncan included, his face pale and defeated. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. As interrogations began, a dark conspiracy unraveled. A secret faction within the palace, a group of high-ranking officials, had orchestrated the kidnapping. Their goal? To use Lady Isabella as a bargaining tool, forcing an influential royal to make a political decision in their favor. She wasn't just a random target, Sophie later explained. Her presence at the palace was kept secret for a reason. Someone wanted to use that secrecy against the crown, but thanks to Tommy, his mother Margaret, and Eddie's instincts, their plan had crumbled. As the dust settled, Eddie found himself standing alone outside the palace gates. He had spent years believing that duty meant standing still, guarding silently, following orders without question, but tonight had proven something else. Duty wasn't about wearing a uniform, it was about standing for what was right. He glanced down at Tommy, who had been the real spark behind everything, a little boy who had risked everything to save someone he'd never even met. Maybe, Eddie thought, this kid understood duty better than most. In a quiet corner of the palace grounds, Tommy was reunited with his mother. Margaret Wells emerged from the shadows, her eyes wet with emotion. She pulled Tommy into her arms, pressing kisses to his forehead. "He thought I lost you," she whispered. Eddie stood back, watching. Tommy looked up, locking eyes with Eddie. A silent thank you. Eddie gave him a small, knowing nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Just another figure fading into the night. Days had passed since that night. Buckingham Palace stood as grand and untouchable as ever. But for Eddie, everything had changed. He walked past the palace gates, no longer in uniform. The crisp red tunic and bearskin hat were gone, replaced by a simple jacket and jeans. The weight of duty, once stitched into his very being, had been lifted. He had resigned from the royal guard, not out of regret, not out of shame, but because he had finally found a new purpose. His feet carried him down the familiar streets, yet for the first time in years he wasn't just a silent observer. He was living, truly living, without the rigid rules that had once defined him. As he rounded the corner near St. James's Park, a voice called out, "Hey, Mr. Eddie." He turned. There, standing on the curb with a small, hesitant grin, was Tommy. The boy jogged up to him, holding something in his hand. A folded note. "Just wanted to say thank you," Tommy said, a little out of breath. Eddie took the note, unfolding it carefully. Inside, written in that same messy, determined handwriting, were just 3 words. "You're my hero." Something in Eddie's chest tightened. He let out a small chuckle, warm, genuine, the first real laugh in a long time. He ruffled Tommy's hair. "You're the real hero, kid," Tommy beamed, and for a brief moment, neither of them needed to say anything else. Eddie tucked the note into his pocket and glanced up at the sky. Then, with a quiet sense of certainty, he turned and walked on, ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.